Hello to our viewers around the world. This is OMN special program we call Deepening Crisis in Ethiopia. This special OMN program is globally broadcasted through social media platform and satellite field televisions, as well as radio to Oromo, Ethiopian, and international audience. We have a great panel ready to discuss and analyze current affairs and latest happening about the current state of Ethiopia. Our panel doesn't need introduction, as they are all familiar to you. We have Professor Ezikael from State of Michigan, United States, and Dr. Tsegaye from Melbourne, Australia. And I'm Tsegaye Hawaz from Pennsylvania, United States, along with our program engineer Fuad from Minnesota. Welcome, gentlemen. Welcome, Professor. Welcome, Dr. Tsegaye.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, let's get to our program. Given we have been going, what have been going in Ethiopia in recent days, especially as the regime is stubbornly unresponsive to Oromos and Amaras and all Ethiopians' questions. We're getting to some uncharted territories. Among everything is happening, we can pick about 2-3 events that happened just recently that were instigated by, 2 of them were, result of instigation of TPLF. The first one being the border conflict that was prompt by TPLF government. And the effects, the negative, the completely counter effect that it created by uniting Oromos from all over Oromia, and getting also the sympathy of all Ethiopians, and also the loud and roaring comeback of Recha 2017 in response to what happened in 2016, the massacre of Bishoftu. That 6-7 million roaring people coming to Bishoftu struck some terror on TPLF's heart, and actually what TPLF thought that it will stop Eritrea probably backfired and ignited a lot of people from all corners of Ethiopia to converge to Bishoftu. And then, of course, just about a week ago news, the sudden resignation of the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Badula Gameda. That too is uniting a lot of people who used to have a different opinion from different perspective. So all this thing is leading to some kind of space that we haven't been before. Let me start from Professor Ezikael. Professor Ezikael, what do all this tell us as far as where we are in the struggle of our people and the regime state itself?
Thank you, Tsegaye. As I always say, and as many have said, that people who go through historical times don't understand they're passing through important historical episodes. So they don't understand that. It's only in retrospect that we understand that we experience some epochal events. So what we are experiencing today, from experience, I would say that the country is going through unprecedented epochal events, transformative possibly, or deleterious if things don't go well. What that simply means is that we're at a critical moment in the country's history. The events tell us about the crossroads, where the country finds itself. To situate our viewers, or situate my own analysis, I think it's important to pay attention to what was going on in the country for nearly now 3 years. Beginning in 2014, there was an Oromo protest that was started by young Oromos in different cities and in university campuses, had engulfed the entire society in one of the regions of the Ethiopian Federation. And the protest started as a spontaneous event, a spontaneous opposition to the government officials' attempt to expand the territory of the capital into the Oromia region, and then a general land grab scheme that was going on around the country. When it started, nobody knew that it was going to last 1 year, but it did last. It's not only the longevity of the protest, but also the resiliency of the protest, that for 1 year, people went on it, went coming back, roaring, as you say, coming back, even as the highly and heavily armed state security forces and the military was deployed to deal with unarmed civilians, young and old, and students and farmers and civil servants, in opposition to an almost totalitarian regime that had controlled the political space altogether and monopolized the economic realm altogether. So it was just a spontaneous revolution from below. So it lasted very long. It was very incessant, determined, and resilient. Came back over and over again, and lasted for a year. And this in itself is unprecedented. That the government, the highly armed government of Ethiopia, I don't know, it's about the 40th armed military in the world, was not able to put down this groundswell of opposition to its policies. What this shows at the stage that we are in is that when it exhausted all possible avenues of controlling the behavior of its citizens, the government resorted to one thing that remained, and that is to impose a state of emergency in October 2016. The state of emergency, it seemed, or it appeared to many, that the state of emergency had suppressed the protest, but it hadn't. So it is in the wake of these at the end of the lifting of the state of emergency that we started to see the events that you mentioned. What do they mean? I think the way I look at it is that this is a conjuncture of events. It's a convergence of events that that looks like have brought to question not only the existence of the regime or the life of the regime to continue to exist, but also brought to question whether the country would remain as a country. Why do I say that? Number one, the convergence of events. The first one is the ruling regime, the TPLF, or the Tsegaye People's Liberation Front led regime of the Ethiopian People's Revolution Democratic forces. It's a strategy for the last quarter of century that it's been in power is basically based on divide and rule. On the one hand, if there is an Oromo protest, there is the OPDO that is working with the government, but there is also the OLF, or the Oromo People's Democratic Organization, or the Oromo People's Liberation Front. Or this is the domestic situation, and there are foreign-based activists. There is also the as the government says, the pro-peace, pro-development, pro-democracy people, and the anti-peace, anti-democracy people. It looked like, after the state of emergency, this dichotomy that had existed for a long time has ended. That the Oromo activists, people who act against the government, have ended up in the same place. That we can judge from the slogans, from the papers, and the positions enunciated by these groups. That's the first thing. After the 2017 Irecha, what we saw is that demonstrators against the government are working with the Oromia state government, especially the Oromia state police is actually guarding the activities of the protesters. Peaceful protest is happening. The Abagada organization, or the traditional authorities within the Oromo society, are working with government officials. That's what we observed. The activists based outside are actually saying the same thing with the officials of the state government. In a word, what we saw in the post-Irecha event is the not only convergence, but the articulation of the position of the Oromo, the demand of the Oromo had also ended up in the same place. They're basically saying the same thing. And finally, On the national question, there was this division within Ethiopia that there are historically, that there are those that believe that there is a national question within Ethiopia, and they demanded for a nationalist response. And there were those who believed that there was no national question within Ethiopia. What existed was simply a regional identity question that could have been dealt with only with local autonomy. Right now, what it looks like is that those Ethiopians, Ethiopian patriots, I would call them, who were more interested in the preservation of the unity and the territorial integrity of Ethiopia, and the Oromo and other groups within the kind of centrifugal elements within Ethiopia are now have ended up in the same place, saying that unless the Oromo question or the question of the nationalities are responded to, are answered, the viability of the country has now come under question. So all of these have come together and made one more thing, that Oromo has always been as outsiders. They were not part of the state. They were always on the periphery. That is their question. They're always been relegated to the periphery economically, politically, and culturally. Now, the Oromo have come back to the center of Ethiopian politics, not just as people bearing demand on the Ethiopian state, but as hope for the Ethiopian people who would be able to democratize the country itself. So that is what I see, the convergence of events. And this together have done something, that they have pushed the Oromo movement onto a new plane, a different chapter in the history of the Oromo struggle. And that is, the protesters are now the defenders of federalism, they're defendants of democratic rights, they're defendants of human rights, and the state is one that is the culprit, that is violating the social contract that Ethiopians had in 1991. So in general, I would say the convergence had pushed the Oromo protest onto the center of Ethiopian politics and onto a new plane.
Okay, that's great. Tsegaye, just want to have you add to what, if you have anything, add to what Ezikael just said, but focus on what is the resemblance of this historical period now to what we saw historically in terms of changes and revolutions in that country and overall in anywhere else for that matter. How is that this current episode, in this time frame, resembles to a dawn of change, in your opinion? Thanks,
Derek. It's very well put by Ezikael that the situation is deepening, the crisis is deepening. And I just would like to jot down, put out some points by way of helping us draw the context properly and situate the whole situation in context, especially for audiences that are not Ethiopian or Oromo. Practically, as we speak, protest is on the rise. It's still mounting, especially the last 3 days. There is an uninterrupted rally in many parts of the country, in Oromia. There is a striking absence of TPLF from the scene, especially since the beginning of the Ethiopian New Year. The pretext is that TPLF, the core in the leading EPRDF regime, is having its annual conference in Mekelle. There are lots of stories that, rumors that are emerging about the agenda they are deliberating on, but for whatever reason it is, they seem to be completely absent from the scene, the public scene, the formal official scene. There is also the economic recession, which led to the devaluation of the Ethiopian currency at the moment. So the economy is not just stagnating, the growth is not just stagnating, there is a serious problem and there is devaluation. The border attacks continue and the resistance to that continues. The humanitarian aid coming by way of a donation to the people that were evicted from the Somali region and from other places continue to mount. And it's very interesting that as we speak, actually a couple of days ago, there was a meeting going on in Khartoum under the aegis of IGAD and the AU on the crisis in Ethiopia, the Ethiopian crisis. And very interesting development is that the Oromia police, which historically is the tool used to repress the protests in Oromia, is increasingly showing gestures of alignment with the population and becoming an agent for peace, stability, law and order, and protection of the rights of citizens, especially guaranteeing human security in times when security is much in need. We are in the aftermath of the Erecha 2007 event, both at Hora Arsidi and Malkati in Sabata. We had this amazing resurgence of cultural shows, so to say, but also using the cultural moment as a site of resistance. And so the cultural turn that this revolution, this protest is taking continues to rise. Of course, the state is in crisis. It has always been, by the way. It has always been in crisis since 1974. And I like to always remind our public that Professor Amara once wrote that Ethiopia is going through crisis, going from crisis to crisis through crisis. And since 1974, it's still in that state of crisis. And what we are threatened with at the moment is not crisis. It's not just a deepened crisis. What we are threatened with is a state collapse. The regime collapse seems to be inevitable. The regime collapse actually is coming probably much sooner than we expected. And that is not entirely unexpected, because this is a regime that has a lot of contradictions within itself for a long time. The historic Ethiopian problems all are embodied in the political party, and the party being a coalition, a very loose, not really loose, it is tightened together by a strong authoritarian grip under TPLF. But if you look at the parties that form the coalition called EPRDF, they are naturally groups that have sometimes competing interests within themselves, at least among the population. So that fault line within the parties was supposed to happen at some point, lead to some conflict, and that is emerging now. And so it is the party, the EPRDF, that is primarily in deep crisis. It is the EPRDF's crisis that is leading to regime crisis, and it is the regime's collapse that might invite a state collapse, but I am generally skeptical about the possibility of state collapse in that part of the world. Now, there is, interestingly, so all this is happening, but at the same time, there is a mixed message that is coming. There is an interesting emergence among the people of a heightened consciousness about peace and stability. The people becoming responsible citizens that ensure peace and security, law and order, justice, and protection of minorities among themselves. And this is very, very interesting. So given that situation, there seems to be a responsible handling of all sorts of things, including the border attacks, of all people by OPDO. We could, had it not been for this group, in fact, which is now really funneled into the center of Ethiopian politics, we could have already stepped into civil war. This is a very interesting thing. Ironically, however, in the discussions in Khartoum, people are saying there are rumors emerging that they want to ditch OPDO and make way for other political actors representing the Oromo public. That's a very interesting development we are going to watch. As Ezikael said earlier on, this crisis has brought Oromo back to the center of politics. It is very interesting. Every time the center can't hold, every time the center seems to weaken, it is the periphery that comes to the center. And in this case, it is the Oromo, which is peripheral historically, that comes to the center to save, as I say, Ethiopia from itself. And this is a very interesting development. This has been seen in the speeches, activities, and actual work done on the ground by the Oromia government officials in relation to the aggression, the Somali, the Liu-Hai aggression on the borders. This has been seen in their behavior in relation to the federal defense forces that are involved in this crisis, deepening the crisis at every spot, everywhere. And this has been seen in the activities of the Oromia regional government to act responsibly, to resettle people, to give aid to the people, when the federal government is completely doing nothing at all. And so you can see that the center's weakness is actually doing good for Ethiopia rather than threatening it with collapse, because the periphery is now taking responsibility, not just for itself, but also the wider country and the broader region in the Horn of Africa. So yes, there is a deepening crisis, and it is not totally unprecedented. I should disagree with Ezikael here. It's not totally unprecedented. Ethiopia has always been in crisis, at least for my age, since 1974. And the crisis we see now, yes, it poses a very difficult challenge, but I think that challenge too is not insurmountable as we stand now. I don't know if I have answered your question, but about the historical comparison, yes, because by nature the Ethiopian state has always been juggling from one crisis to another and another. We might, in the event that the regime collapses altogether, which de facto almost has, we might end up at that spot where we found ourselves in 1974. There were two challenges back then. The first challenge is to democratize the country. The second challenge was to transform the state-society relationship, to respond to the issue, for example, of nationalities and national minorities, to respond to religious equality, etc., and generally to re-evaluate and redefine citizenship in that country. And through this, the state-society relationship was to be redefined. And that challenge remains to be postponed until today. And again, if the regime collapses now, that question comes back to face us. The second was the issue of economic justice, the issue of ensuring economic justice in 1974, hence the land to the tiller motto and all that, slogan and all that. And the land to the tiller demand was made by making land a state property, and further on since 1991, making that state property available to investors, not to the tiller. So that same question over land, that same question over identity, the issues of language and so on and so forth, are still coming back in order to help us redefine the state-society relationship. So are we going to perhaps go back to that stage where we are going to face the recurring Ethiopian question, the questions of Ethiopian politics again? I think so. I think these questions are going to be faced by a different generation, a generation that knows better, a generation that has an interesting sense of responsibility, not just for itself, but also for a wider sector of the society. So yes, we are at that uncertain point, but with a different kind of vision, different generation, with a different generation that has a different kind of vision and a different set of skills to rise to the challenge.
Great. I think I'm gonna get back to you, Tagish. Everything that you analyzed and elaborated get close to my second question. So I'm gonna frame it this way. There is a great quote that you got from Dr. Maraguddina. We are in a crisis, going through a crisis since 1974. Yes, there are a couple of regime changes that we observed in my lifetime. The first one being the 1974, and then when EPLF and TPLF broke the Derg's back, the 1991. In both cases, first on the 1974 cases, there wasn't that much a ground swelling consciousness that is far-reaching, that is in the government than people and taxi drivers, students, maybe university students, and such. So there wasn't a ground for a big and black and white kind of differences among conscious people back then. And of course, once there came, you already elaborated, there answered whatever it answered, and whatever it did answer came up with a Stalinist socialist answer. All nations are under one communist philosophy, so there wouldn't be necessary, it is all the world is proletarian united. So it was diffused that way. But that is true. So the crisis continued, and now when TPLF came on, even though it did not answer the nation and nationality questions properly, and it did not create a working and a truthful federalism, but it used the idea to divide people. And over the course of the last 26 years, it found division, suspicious, and all that kind of malicious things among the people. So that is a little bit different setup than what we had before. So from this perspective, how real can be the threat of catastrophe at the event of the regime failure, consequently the state failure? How catastrophic do you think it is from this perspective? So, okay, I'll come back to you, and then I'll give Ezikael opportunity to give his opinion on this.
Yeah, I think I would not think of. First of all, I cannot predict that it will be catastrophic or it won't be catastrophic. Anything is possible. But my own hunch, and probably what I like to believe, is that it won't be that catastrophic. The reason I say this is that, as you also indicated, this protest has shown a lot of responsible citizenship among people from all corners. And yes, the 1974 revolution had effectively articulated the grievances of the people, but the actual participants in the act of revolution were educated university students, high school students, taxi drivers, urban proletarian class. And compared to that today, the people who are involved in this protest are basically almost everyone, which includes the intellectual class, the cultural class, people performing in the high art sector, and that's why almost every revolutionary activity seems to be taking a poetic level, a very colorful and aesthetic level. It is a politics that is packed aesthetically, to be honest, and so there is a heavy involvement of the cultural class. There is a heavy involvement, very interestingly, of the business class, the economic class, in Oromia at least. And this has been seen in the case of the humanitarian activity. But even before that, in many ways, the business class is heavily involved, because the business class itself. Now, this is very interesting. This is ironic also, because TPLF since 1997, one of its declared goals was to eliminate the intellectual, the business, and the cultural class of Oromos, to break Oromo nationalism that might war against the regime. And this has been published in their own newsletter. And they have been really targeting the economic class, the business class, the intellectual class, and the cultural class by threatening them with prisons, with jails, with attacks, and forcing them out to go on exile. And of course, today in this globalized world, to go on exile is not to be disconnected from your homeland. And so those people who are pushed out and went on exile are performing home in exile and trying to do what is called by anthropologists as long-distance nationalism. Now that's also paying back. And as a consequence of that, these particular classes are now are coming back in vengeance, really, are coming back to respond to the push by the regime, and they are heavily part of this resistance at the moment. Now, in that sense, then, there is a difference between the 1974 revolution and the one that is happening now in terms of magnitude of the participants. Number two, there is a generation that has grown learning about its civic rights and responsibilities in the last 25 years. And this generation has been through a system that used minority rights regimes, that used federalism, diversity management or pluralism, etc., as a means of elite cooptation. The TPLF put in place the federal dispensation in such a way that it can basically find some collaborators from the elites of the different ethnic groups and act as their patron, whereas they would serve as their client. However, the federalism, the language of federalism itself, the language of democracy, the language of human rights that is put in place in the constitution and that went into the civic education has now empowered the Oromo young people who have come back to say, well, if this is federalism, then why are we not having self-rule? If this is a regime of human rights, then why are we not having our leaders released from free from political trials? If this is democracy, then why are we not electing our leaders? If this is a socially just system, why are our people being evicted? These are the kind of questions that funneled all this revolution at the moment. Now, given these are the people who are involved, would there be a catastrophe? I suggest no. I suggest that it won't be catastrophic. Here is why. The regime worked deliberately to create catastrophes. Because as I said, as I've been on record saying, this is a regime that uniquely survives and thrives on conflicts. It trades on fear and terror. It actually fabricates and orchestrates conflicts. And you can remember the attacks, the border attacks on Oromia by the Somali Liu Hail, the special police forces, the fact that the federal armed forces and intelligence forces are almost visibly doing some interesting activities everywhere, the massive lawlessness and corruption of the leading class, the elite, the TPLF class, in doing arms sales, arms trafficking, human trafficking, contraband activities, import-export, illicit import-export activities, and so on and so forth. Now, when you see that, it was the people who were actually demanding that law and order be preserved. It was the people who were actually saying, wait, we need to do some restraint on how we react to the aggressor. Wait, it is not the people, it is the regime. It's not the people, it is a mercenary group. So when you see all this, perhaps this is a moment when an enlightened generation is taking part. And let's not forget the fact that there was a universal enrollment in education has contributed to this too over the years. And the civic education and the language of human rights, federalism, etc., that was put in constitutions for other purposes, but also went into the civic education classes, have created a generation that is more enlightened to conduct itself responsibly vis-a-vis the state and vis-a-vis its neighbors. So when you consider these things, I think the age of making irresponsible politics is gone, so the catastrophe can be avoided. If catastrophe is going to be the scenario, we could have seen it last week. We could have seen it in this last month. We didn't. And probably, I think there is a gesture of now. Just yesterday, we have seen the gesture of Oromos trying to go to collaborate with the Amara in working on the Tana Lake. And all these things suggest that there would not be catastrophe. And the fact that the alignment now we see is between the Oromo and Amhara parties. These things suggest that because these are parties with huge constituency in the country, the catastrophe might be averted as long as the TPLF is kept at bay.
Thank you, Zagish. Professor Ezikael, you see, Tsegaye admittingly, he said he's not a wizard, but he doesn't see catastrophe. We can take your take on this, but in addition to that, if you can see the other side, and just for hypothetical reason, we go to that territory. What would be the role of international community, different segment of Oromo organizations or whatever, the Ethiopian people in general, and all the stakeholders of that place, including, of course, the international committee? What should they do to avoid this imminent danger if we see something bad would happen with the state collapse that some predict?
I'm not a prophet either, and I am not a wizard either, so I can just only look at scenarios of what might happen. And I usually base my my analysis or the scenarios that I can see by looking deep into Ethiopian history. So if we don't go really further, but just look at the last 50 years, and this is pertaining to the question that you asked a guy, so that I could situate myself as well there. Revolutions did happen in the last 50 years. Governments were changed. First in 1994 and then in 1991. As the guy explained, the fall of the imperial regime in 1974 happened 14 years after the first attempt that gave fair warning to the imperial regime that things were not going very well. It is the insistence of the imperial regime, especially the emperor, Haile Selassie, in 1960, returning from his visit in Brazil, gave a press conference in which he said nothing is going to change. When his own generals, among the generals, the people that were actually supposed to be protecting him, the imperial guard, protested. They rose in rebellion against him. They effectively deposed him in concert with students. But that rising groundswell of opposition to the imperial regime did not indicate to the powers that be that it was a warning that reform was needed. So when they refuse reform, the issue is not politics, it becomes physics. That is, tension must relax, otherwise it will snap. So what happened in 1974 was that because of the refusal of the imperial regime to see the writing on the wall and then respond according to popular demands, that actually led to a collapse of the imperial regime. The people that took over power were not supposed to take power. These were the military, but there was really no organized party to replace the imperial regime when it collapsed. And that is important. that regimes in Ethiopia actually collapse. They don't leave power. They do not see the writing on the wall. They don't see, as the Chinese say, that the mandate has ended. So they just keep on. Once their legitimacy has ended, they just keep on beyond the legitimacy that they could enlist from the people. In 1991, what happened in 1991 as well, but let me underscore this idea that there was an organized military, a military that was a state military that stepped in and to maintain law and order and to defend the country when it was attacked, because the military at that time was basically a national military. It was not a military of the emperor. It came from all areas. So they pledged allegiance to the well-being of the country. That took over. It was also fashionable at that time for a military coup d'etat. It was not out of place for the military to step in. But in 1991, it resulted for a never-ending war, a civil war, first in the east and then in the north, in which people were surrendering their sons, their daughters to some extent. Everybody was going to the war front, as the leader at that time saying, everything to the war front was the motto. Everything was geared toward winning war, and the government could not simply negotiate with its opponents. They are intent on crushing their opponents rather than trying to see the other side. Then the military itself that was fighting this war rose against the government. Even then, when the incumbent regime had the power or the opportunity to reform, they didn't. In fact, they killed the generals while in the midst of war. The Soviet Union stopped supplying them weapons, and it collapsed again. The point that I'm making is this: regimes collapse in Ethiopia. They don't give up power. It's not been in the history. Now, in 2017, as I agree with Tsegaye that the writing is on the wall, the legitimacy has expired. I have never seen such a pent-up anger against the regime, even in 1991 or 1974. The level of rejection of this government, the loss of mandate to rule, is just unprecedented. If you don't, Tsegaye may not like it, but this is a very different scenario. But who's going to take it over? Who's going to take over in case, and in an event that there will be a collapse of regime had happened in times of crises in the past? Who's going to take over? For the last 25 years, this government or the party that is in power not only devastated or decimated any opposition, run them out of office, killed many of them, landed many of them in jail. It's not only that, it has actually legalized and actually tried to make dictatorship acceptable to the world, as the Economist said about Meles Zenawi when he died. This is the regime that had actually made it, of course, made a presentation saying that we should be there and the development state should rule in perpetuity. No shame whatsoever. And using the international war on terror as a pretext, they have armed themselves to the teeth, and they've relied financially on international institutions, foreign governments, especially the West. So they are firmly in place. Here is what you have right now: a heavily armed military that is politically connected, deeply connected politically, and economically reliant on its own businesses. This is the military that you have. That means it has an inherent interest in the maintenance of the status quo. And the military could do that. So what they are doing right now, from the description that Tsegaye was giving us, is preparing the ground for the military to take over. And they will say the constitutional order is in danger. It is incumbent on the national military to save the day and to save the country from disintegration and the constitutional order from falling into the hands of dictators. That's what they've done in the past in Egypt. That's what they've been doing in Turkey. This is what is going on. Now, would that mean a catastrophic failure? I think what you see in this, I could call it maybe the intra-state conflicts between Oromia and the Somali state, where 45,000 strong Liu force or a special force organized by the central government is actually being used from the Somali region to attack Oromia. We also see leaders of these two regional states engaged in a war of words in which one accuses the other of murder, mayhem, and being anti-federal. Now, what do you make of this? That when two federal states are actually accusing each other of being the anti-federalists. Recently, the Oromia state government has begun to suggest, and this is important, has begun to suggest that some elements within the federal system, particularly the military, are engaged, they say, in contraband trade. What that simply means is some elements of the Eastern Command and former military people, retired military, are engaged in a sort of a government where the federal government cannot do anything in the eastern part of the country. They smuggle, they sell arms, they export agricultural products, they import arms, supply themselves. Then they could simply wage war that the central government cannot control in the eastern part of the country. Now, what do other observers say? This is the question. I think the military, former military people within the government that are inside the country, like the chief of staff or the commander of the Air Force, former commander of the Air Force, are saying this cannot go on. There are signs of state collapse. They say that. One of the great observers of Ethiopian politics, an astute observer, I would say, René Lafort, had long ago suggested Mengist Yellam. There is no government. That is the perception of people. That the collapse is not a hypothetical scenario. It is something that observers are also looking at. There is also this idea that Tsegaye touched on. This is a government that works on the basis of cash. There should be some cash flow to do what it does, to feign support for himself, to organize demonstrators. Look, this government has not been able to stage counter demonstration. Why is that? Because it's bankrupt. The state of emergency is a very expensive enterprise. So, as you just said, the narrative of Ethiopia rising of the 2 years ago is now replaced by this downward spiral on the economy. So the legs of this government are really breaking down. The political system is fragmenting. You mentioned, Dereje, about the Amara, the ANDM, the Amara National Democratic Movement, pulling away from the TPLF. You could see the OPDO, or the Oromo People's Democratic Organization, also pulling away from the central government in many ways. What you see is the centrifugal forces are pulling away from the center. The center is being weakened. I think the guy is right, seeing that the weakening of the center has now given space for people to step in, make their voices heard. So that we can say is a good thing. But here is what my point is. In 1991, when this government took over, there was hope. People gave them the benefit of the doubt that they will be able to respond to these major questions of Ethiopian politics over the last 50 years. This is the land ownership issue and the question of identity, or the national question. They tried to respond to it frontally, and they were applauded for it. They said, to address the national question, we would federalize the structure of the Ethiopian government to make sure that citizens with voice have emerged. We will democratize the space. A quarter of a century later, one of the signs of the transition to a peaceful transition of power, that is a peaceful transfer of power, hasn't occurred. Federalization had been replaced by centralization, and people have stepped in, insisting, as the guy was saying, on saving it. So if there is any hope that there would not be a catastrophic collapse that would have reverberations in the area, it would be because now people are empowered. They're conscious. They know what to do. They know what to say. Other than that, I cannot see an organized body that is ready to take over. That worries me.
Great. Ezikael, I think I'm going to come back to you. You can answer this, or you can elaborate on this with including it. So one of the things you mentioned was the regime collapse, if I understood it correctly, might be temporarily be averted by some type of a military coup d'etat taking a hold. And as we all know, probably this might be a little news to our international audience. Since 1991, the TPLF regime took over this government. The military and the security is heavily owned by a single organization, the TPLF, who leads this government. And about 98% of the military officers and all very important security people are all from that regime or from that area. But the TPLF, when TPLF created EPRDF, was fraudulent by nature, because it seems like it is all people of Ethiopia are taking part in this government through their ethnicity, like the NDM representing Amara, OPDO representing Oromo, the Southern People Organization doing that, Somali, Benishangul, and all that attempted to do that. So this fraudulent lie lasted for 26 years, and now here we are at this point, without leaving still the bad part of or the pessimistic prediction of state collapse or the coup d'etat that is going to result in more treacherous problem that even creates more complication in terms of nation and nationalities relationship and all that. The top two members of this EPRDF are the OPDO and the NDM, covering or representing 2/3 of probably the Ethiopian population. This is very important to these two people. The saving of the state collapse is tremendously important to these people. As a matter of fact, to all people. So what is the responsibility of the OPDO and the NDM, especially at this point of time? What responsibility should they have to avert this failure, Professor Ezikael?
The reason that I said that there is probably no organized political force that could readily step in. Look, I don't see the process of that transition right now. I don't see this government looking, just like its predecessors, looking at the lay of the land, evaluating what is good for them, and then save the country from catastrophic interaction among people. I don't know what they're doing. My scenario is that they're preparing for a military takeover. On the other hand, the question that he asked is that they're trying to take over because they have lost all legitimacy.
The takeover is by TPLF, Ezikael.
The TPLF has lost all legitimacy.
And then the takeover is the TPLF army itself.
That you have already made, how that is really, that military is a politically connected military. It's actually a politicized military. It's not a national military for all intents and purposes, as you just indicated, especially the command structure. That is the only thing that is left for the TPLF-led regime in Ethiopia. The loss of legitimacy, because of like this economic growth in return of for people loyalty that the former prime minister was enunciated and followed for the last 10 years, had run its course. Especially if the economy is not growing, there will be no basis for the EPRDF to claim any semblance of legitimacy. In my view, that has ended. There is no legitimacy. It's not a legitimate government. That is what this shows, that when people are actually stepping into that void and say, we need the restoration of constitutional rights. We need the federal system to operate genuinely. We need people that are in prison, our leaders that are in prison, to be released. The saving grace of this situation is that the people are actually more responsible than the government. They are saving the whole system against a government that had run amok. Now, on the other hand, the elite that could organize a new idea, a new process, with the exception of what Tsegaye mentioned taking place in the Sudan, maybe, there is really no organized body to step in right now because of the devastation that had occurred over the last 25 years. And the elites are not, the elites of these groups are not looking at the future. They're just looking at the immediate turn of events, and they're looking at what is good for their political parties rather than what is good nationally for the people. So that is the pessimistic part. But this could come together very well. But that's important, that constitutional rule, democratic rule, respect for human rights, or for all people, that is important. And if that is done, then we have a chance for a transition to a dispensation where people could identify with the national cause and come together. But there is this problem on the side of the opposition to come together, look beyond their own self-intent, transcend their party and ideological loyalty and affinity, and look at the future, the long-term future, and the well-being of people in general, their own people and people or the citizens of Ethiopia in general. That is an important step for them to take.
Thank you. So, Tsegaye, without leaving from this point, especially on the role of OPDO and NDM, I can throw something that you said in previous segment, that there are some activities that the TPLF desperately doing, having some meetings and alliances and all in neighboring countries and all there, possibly to undermine maybe the satellite organizations that are under EPRDF, to harass them or to show them there is another alternative that he can do without them and all that. So with this all tied, what do you think these two organizations must do not to open this scenario for TPLF and hurt themselves and hurt the nation?
Yeah, I think the core of this regime is TPLF, and all the rest were appendages, fabricated, the handiworks, really, the handiworks of TPLF. When we talk about regime collapse, we are talking about TPLF collapse. And as I said, this regime, EPRDF, is going to collapse primarily because of its own internal crisis, more than an assault from outside. For all practical purposes, military action against this regime has ended a long time ago, particularly since 2007, when since 2001, it has always been a strategic ally of the West in its war against terrorism. Therefore, it used that gesture from the West to eliminate its opponents internally. Since 2005, after the post-election crisis, they actually reinforced their military power, and they tried to eliminate, they used the army and security institutions to eliminate the opposition, enfeeble the ones that they chose to have within the country. Since 2007, with the anti-terrorism law in place and with their intervention in Somalia, they have literally moved a very strong military into the Eastern Division and crushed, militarily speaking, crushed the ONLF and the remnants of OLF military within in the parts of the east and the southern Ethiopia, in the east and southern part of Ethiopia. Now, so the threat that the hope that they would collapse under a military attack by any opposition is gone And they actually came out in 2009, 2010. Meles came out and said, we have buried the opposition. We have buried OLF. Prime Minister Hailemariam Desalegn said, OLF is dead and buried just a few years ago, I mean 2012, after the 2012. Now, where does that leave us then? Any end of the regime, any end to this regime, is not going to come by their willing relinquishment of power. No. Of all people, TPLF, the children of the core of the authoritarian Abyssinian state, they will not relinquish power. It is not in their culture, in their political culture, I mean. It is not in their formation. They are a military liberation front that assumed power in 1991. They are not willing to leave that. So what is going to happen? What was going to happen was that the EPRDF itself will die of its own internal crisis, or TPLF itself will die out of its own crisis. And there was a sign in 2001 when the splinter happened, which Meles kind of overcame through his own political astuteness. Now, what is happening now is the fragmentation of EPRDF. There is a part of EPRDF, the core, the TPLF, which basically is trying to continue to rule through its usual tradition, militarily overpowering all the other parts of the country and all the other parties, which it is finding difficult to do at the moment. Part of the reason is the hitherto weak parts of EPRDF, in particular OPDO and ANDM, are stepping out. And they were basically stepping out in the sense that they're not really leaving the party, at least officially so far. They were basically saying no to TPLF. What does that suggest? The fact that they are saying no to TPLF, and in the case of OPDO, basically operating against the rogue behavior of the federal institutions, the federal military, etc., shows that maybe its own redemption is going to come from within. So EPRDF, if it's going to survive this crisis, it's not going to survive as EPRDF as we knew it so far. It is going to be a more democratic EPRDF that actually gives due place to the parties in accordance with their constitutional base and their constituency. So the fragmentation of EPRDF empowered the groups within EPRDF that were not powerful before. They are now empowered because of the empowerment of the citizenry, which is their constituency. So what we are going to have is the end to this regime, a very responsible end to the TPLF regime, the TPLF rule, is going to happen through the work of the OPDO and the ANDM. How does that happen? There are a number of things they can do. The first is stepping out, saying no. The resignation of Abdullah Gamada last week had really struck terror in the heart of TPLF already. We haven't yet known what he's up to, what he wants to do after this. He just said, I'm going to be on the backbench, and I'm going to work with my party and with the parliament, for the people that elected me. Okay. Sooner or later, he's going to do something within the party, and within the parliament, he is a member, I think. Because he hasn't left the parliament, he hasn't left the party, so he's there to do something. Why did this happen? I think part of the reason why these forces in the ANDM and in the OPDO are taking a step to say no is because the usual manner of TPLF trying to use the military to suppress everyone and put them in their place is becoming unacceptable to them. Is this survival through contriving conflicts is being unacceptable to them. Their interest to move the military into Oromia and crush the protests and divide the region and continue to rule. That kind of gesture gives a wrong signal to even the loyal OPDO. And one such person so far has been Abadullah Gamada. He led. So the first thing they do is to speak back to TPLF, to say no. And second, because they are majority in the parliament, they can begin to use the federal parliament to move the entire federal government institutions to a better end. That's the second thing they can do. And thirdly, they have to reconnect with their constituency, with their people, realign their programs, their ways of operation, etc., with their constituency. If you look at the way the new OPDO, the Lemma team, is operating, they are really trying to align themselves to the people, instead of them talking to the people, because people do not anymore listen to the politicians. They are the ones who listen to the people. They are the ones who are actually speaking the language of the people. They try to imitate and follow the people. So those kinds of things. And the same is true for the ANDF. If they really find a foot in their people, then the empowerment that people had through the work of activists, through the work of opposition political parties over the years, now this will empower these parties within EPRDF, and now fortifies them to that position where they can move the federal government institutions in their favor and against the rogue TPLF rule. So those are the kind of things they can start doing, and also forge a solidarity that never existed before among themselves and among their people. Because if you have noticed the reactions of some TPLF cadres on cyber media and in different other places, even in Ethiopian medias, is that the TPLF is going to use the peripheral states, the states of Western and Eastern peripheries like Benishangul Gumuz, Gambela, Somali, Harari, and Afar against the Oromo and other, mainly the Amara regions. Now, this means if the regime is going to collapse, it's going to collapse because of the crisis from within. If the regime is going to survive and bring the country into a more responsible kind of transition, both to democracy and transformed state-society relationship, it is through its own internal entities, these OPDO and INDM. There is a historic responsibility that is crumbling upon their shoulders. So they have two things to do: look down to the people and take up the people's slogans, and then rise up to the challenge and face TPLF and move the House, the federal parliament, change the laws and change the prime minister, probably take the prime ministerial position from within and move the army to bring peace to the country. Now that's the political deal. Now, obviously the TPLF doesn't want this. What the TPLF has been working on is to create a semblance, to contrive conflicts, to create a semblance of crisis, and intervene through the army and impose a military rule, because it is the army that is in their hands now, and then through that continue to rule. Now that is not going to be possible because the army is no more feared, and if the politics is weak, you see, if the prime minister was a kind of person who can easily order or sign on a decision TPLF wants and moves the commander-in-chief, move the chief of staff, then everything could have ended so far. The fact that they haven't done that already shows that to a certain extent, the military power is still subservient to the political power to a certain extent, especially when the prime minister is not a TPLF member. That's what we are seeing. So there is a hope for these two parties, to move the parliament and probably change the political figurehead, change the political ruler, the prime minister, and then change from there, restrain the military and move the country into a responsible position. Now, I agree with Ezikael that there are no political parties that can, other than the ones that are within EPRDF, to come to the place, to the position where they can kind of broker a safe transition. Yes, why? Because the ones that are in Ethiopia are enfeebled through various acts, bureaucratic, legislative, and judicial, crippling. They are crippled and they are enfeebled, and the leaders are in prison. Okay, but that doesn't mean they can't take part in the event that there is some kind of transition. In the event that where we keep TPLF at bay, they can be released, and then a new term of negotiation can exist. But yes, internally the political parties are enfeebled. Externally, the ones that are on exile are weak and disorganized. Some of them almost non-existent except by name. All right. Now, these parties obviously can't offer much of a responsible leadership to take control of the country and to lead the country into a transformed state-society relationship, a democratic order. No, they can't. They can't also. So the other scenario left is a coup d'etat. Coup happens only if the military wants to totally dismiss the parliament, all right, arrest the prime minister, and impose itself as a military ruler. That requires some degree of serious crisis caused by the prime minister and the responsible governments in the regions. I do not think that is happening. And this is why, for example, Team Lemma in Oromia is kind of carefully playing their cards, trying to show themselves responsible, trying to rail against the lawless bunch of people within the federal government and institutions, and yet not to speak out loudly. That is the kind of maneuvering they are doing, so that they will not be seen as openly fighting against the TPLF, and invite the military to come in and do whatever it wants. So, and there is also another thing. The Ethiopian military, yes, it's a very politicized military, but it is generally manipulated, guided, ruled by the TPLF elite. But there is an interesting development here. The political leaders in TPLF and the military leaders, the TPLF military leaders in the army, have some kind of disconnect. The military leaders within the army are corrupt, have been pursuing their own goals, in the absence of a strong political leadership in TPLF. So because the political leadership in TPLF is weak, and the military leadership in the army is kind of, what should I say, is corrupt and has been robbed of moral authority to rule, and the legitimacy crisis that you have been talking is also directed against them. And in fact, it is that legitimacy crisis that OPDO is using against them, trying to take control of their economic vested interests and so on and so forth. I think there is a limit to what they can do. There is a limit to what they can do, because in the absence of a strong TPLF political leadership, which, for example, is on par with Meles, for example, I don't think the military leadership can move the army to do lots of things as it used to do in the past. So within the TPLF, within the military itself, let's not forget that there are other politicized military generals, like from the OLF wing, from the OPDO wing, from the NDM wing, people who had kept their grievances for a long time and who are still there. So I do not think it is easy for TPLF to move the military now and do whatever it wants. And there is a lot of opportunity for OPDO and NDM to do something, to use the political platform they have to move the parliament and bring about change.
Thank you, Zagish. Let me get back to Ezikael. As Tsegaye eloquently laid down the responsibilities of these two organizations, he started with saying the regime fail is exclusively a TPLF fail. Therefore, I could assume that these two organizations, NDM and OPDO, could be a custodian to this Oromo and Amara protest. As you know, I mean, in spite of now, Tsegaye indicated something that I myself heard too. That's the negotiation that TPLF is doing, a very ill-conceived negotiation, would probably partly to get ahead of this OPDO and the NDM future, maybe coming to their prospective people's struggle, and so on. And with that, actually TPLF is rumored to have some kind of open contact with some of diaspora political organizations that once he himself labeled terrorists. So this indicates where this is going. So we don't want to go back to the role of OPDO and NDM as Tsegaye really laid it out. But let's see from the population's point of view, from the Amara and Oromo people's point of view. How do they have to respond to these two organizations? Should they be the wind behind these organizations with verifying and then trusting, or should they be at all costs obstruct, lumping them with TPLF? What is in both cases, what is the risk? The risk into trusting without any verification, trusting these two organizations will be the custodian of the struggle, versus no, they are still handmade, TPLF handmade, and we should just see them together and be roadblock to them. So what is the risk in this two, and what is expected of the people of Oromo and Amaras? I think after Ezikael, Tsegaye, you can elaborate on this more too. So I'll pass it to Ezikael.
I think we can only discuss possible scenarios of how transition might occur. I think the Amara people know their interests, the Oromo people know their interests, and they know which organization actually represents their interests and which does not. So I will not get into the business of telling them how to support, how much to trust, but I think what we can do is to simply analyze events and processes and then suggest possible scenarios. And I think I can see what Tsegaye was saying. But Tsegaye, I mean, mine is another scenario. Tsegaye's analysis is based on the notion that TPLF, which he said is really the core of the regime, which I agree with, is at this moment a rational actor that hemmed in with all kinds of problems, multi-dimensional crisis, economic crisis, political crisis, security crisis, all of these situations that kind of hemmed in, pressure with all of these pressures, that it will be thinking rationally, looking at events and processes and the array of forces that are the forces that are arrayed against it. I think here is the way I look at it. Number one, there is this book that a guy that I really like wrote a long time ago, says seeing like a state. Yeah. When you are in a state power, you don't see what the underlings see. You're not able to see that because you are a state. That's what I'm. One of the things that I would like to say, that at this point in time, after 25 years of exercising absolute, uncontested power, that the TPLF would imagine or contemplate losing power, they will fight it to the end, because they can't see. They don't see what we see. They can feel it. And they have gotten to some kind of enough time, they've gotten to a crisis situation, and they have overcome those crises. The last one that they had was in 2005. But let me put this on a premise. That is to say, this absolute power, as Lord Acton, Lord Dago said, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But Will and Ariel Durant qualified this observation and says that power demands even more than it corrupts, lowering the guard of foresight and raising the haste of action. I think this is the situation that the TPLFs find itself. Absolute power not only corrupts, it demands. That's exactly what I meant by the state too. So to think that the TPLF is really looking at how the power reigning of power is the same as it was is not something that I subscribe to, because they are really blind at this point in time. What they see is one thing, and I will explain why I say that. There is only one thing that they're looking at. In the aftermath of the last time that TPLF faced a real threat to its power in 2005, during the election of 2005, the TPLF envisaged that it could stay in power and prevent popular grievances from forming into national consciousness and then form into national resistance by tightening its control over the political space and the political system, by gaining complete dominance on the economic realm, and centralizing the structure of power. For the last 10 years, by using this power in which they win 100% of the seats in power, they also legislate, pass laws that help them to constrain opposition altogether. That's their history. That's what they have done. And at the same time, and this is important from my perspective, this idea of gaining total dominance over the economic realm, they have done it to some extent successfully by using this party-owned businesses, like the Endowment Fund for the Rehabilitation of Tsegaye, which now has a capitalization of about 3 billion in official estimates and employs about 50,000 people. But the associated parties also have Tirets for the A&M, TUMSA for OPDO, and Wando for OPDO. Heaven knows how much they are involved. All we can say from the record that we have, the party businesses are engaged in all sectors of the economy. There is no sector of the economy in which they do not operate. Service, banking, manufacturing, agriculture, transportation, every sector of the economy, they control it, which means they have a stake to remain in power, because it's power that gave them economic dominance in the first place. It is the absolute power that they created, or tight control over power that they created, that helped them to use or capture the state, and use it for economic gains. I am not sure they're ready to give up this power.
No.
The other thing that remained for them, and I'm talking about economic power, not just political power, the monopoly of political power. The other thing that they created, and I alluded to this, is a military, not only that is politicized and political, but also an economy that actually is involved in the economy, in businesses. Now, this military is involved in the economy, in all sectors of the economy, in manufacturing, in construction, in energy, in transportation, in service, in every area, agriculture, for God's sakes. Not only that, this is also a military that manufactures and supplies weapons that it needs for the country's defense, including armored vehicles, explosives, ammunition, big guns, light guns. The only thing that they did not manufacture is airplanes and helicopters. So my point is that what they want to defend is political power that is total. It's economic power that is absolute. And the only thing that remained for them to remain in power is the military that is politically connected, economically influential, and heavily armed. It produces the armament for itself. So they don't see the rationale, the rational analysis that Tsegaye is suggesting, because they are in power, and absolute power demands. They still think that power, the brute force, could be used. Look, let me say this and end. When a regime loses legitimacy, the only thing that remains to that regime is, when you have lost all legitimacy, is naked power. Brute force is what remains. Dictatorial regimes, totalitarian regimes, never concede power, never try to rationalize. All they want to do is to use the power that they have, the brute force that they have, to the end, to the ultimate end. The problem is, the force that you have, the military force that you have, cannot be used. You can use it against an aggressor. You can use it against country. But against your own people in perpetuity, it cannot be used. Power tells you, brute force tells you one thing. The regime had lost all its ammunition, all the tools in the repertoire of tools in the toolkits. It's lost all of that. So we can say it's come to its end. But they don't realize that. They don't realize. I really don't know what's going on in Sudan or anywhere else. All I see is a government that is trying to incite young people to come into the streets, shoot them, and then declare that the country is engulfed in chaos and that it rests on the military to save citizens from bloodshed, to save the constitutional rule from crumbling, or to save the country from external threats. That is the scenario that I see right now. Is that going to save them? I do not think so. Brute force never ended. Cicero said it that in 2,000 years ago. It is true today. But I don't think they see the scenarios that you see because they see like a state. And as Will Durant said, absolute power that they exercised for 25 years demands absolutely.
And Tsegaye, I'm going to come back to you for the last segment of this conversation. Ezikael added more flavor to what TPLF is doing in terms of getting and inciting young people out and to shoot them and then to make it something else so it can have a legitimacy to control or to demolish everything at once. But with that, I want you to stay, and I don't know how I want to frame it, but I want you to stay to what is expected of the people message, and if you can conclude that. Yes.
Me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, it is true. In James Scott's language, when you are a state, there is a particular way of seeing things, and seeing like a state obviously is seeing from a position of power, and you don't see exactly what is where. They do miss that, yes, and I agree with you absolutely in saying that TPLF is not willing to relinquish power. And I actually add, not just because they are invested in the economy, they're not just because they want a total political power, but because there is also a cultural element in it. There is fundamentally an authoritarian culture that raised them. It's thoroughgoing, so there is no way one can hope that they would relinquish power peacefully. If they were to relinquish power peacefully, and if they were really believing in the constitutional order they take oath on, if they were really willing to relinquish power democratically, they would have had, a long time ago, they would have had a free election, they would have used the constitutional procedures, they would have honored the constitutional commitments, they would have upheld the rule of law, and that way they could have taken risks to see how much of that power they can keep legally, legitimately, and how much of that power they can concede. The fact that they are not willing, there has never been a sign that they are willing to relinquish it is evidence that this is not going to end easily. It's not because they want to that this is going to end and the regime is going to collapse. So what are they going to do? Now, very interestingly, TPLF has always ruled through brute force. I mean, the rest of the thing, whether it is the constitution, legalities, laws, and so on and so forth, they were not meant to really operate. I always talk about the constitutions behind the constitution in Ethiopia. There is parliamentary democracy in the constitution. There is democratic centralism in the political party. There is a liberal human rights, etc. clause in the constitution. There is no such thing in the political program. The TPLF is a party that has clearly set itself a goal of staying in power for the coming this many years. And what is happening now is a little too premature for them. It is taking them by surprise. No, they don't. And it's because they do not relinquish power that this internal fragmentation is going to become their undoing, and the redemption of the hitherto handiwork of TPLF, meaning OPDO and ANDM. Okay, until today they were the handiwork of TPLF. They are the messengers of TPLF in Oromia, as Amara poetically says. They are representatives of TPLF in Oromia. They are not. Yes, that's and I and you have repeatedly said in explicit terms that the OPDO is a criminal organization. Yes, that's what it is by nature. It was meant to muzzle the Oromo people's voice. But now, this act of stepping aside or stepping out of the TPLF line of rule may be their redemption too. And we have been seeing the signs of that in the last few months, how people respond to the OPDO leaders and so on and so forth, how people worry every day about the well-being of their OPDO leaders, you know, whether Lemma is in prison, Lemma is dead, Lemma is away, etc. You know, this sense of panic among the ordinary peoples in Oromia, much to my liking, my dislike, shows to you that somehow people are warming up to this leadership, and this may as well be the redemption of these institutions. Now, this redemption is not coming easily. This redemption is coming because there is a fatigue in the TPLF military in mobilizing brute force. People are saying, have seen the worst nightmares. They have been killed and they still protest in front of tanks, in front of a helicopter trying to smother them. I mean, people have seen the worst. Jails are full of Oromo people. Young people are no more afraid of being jailed, especially after that pronouncement by Bekkele Garba, the true moral leader in Ethiopia today, who said, you jail all 40 million of us, or you jail, you free us. That's what he said. And people, these words echo everywhere. And people are no more afraid of going to jail. People are no more afraid of being killed. People are no more afraid of being displaced or whatever. They have seen the worst phase of brute force, and this is not stopping them. TPLF now reckons with that. I know states don't see like we see, but they have already seen that this is not stopping, and they have worried a lot about what to do next. So what I suspect is that they are going to buckle, not because they want, but because they can't do anything about it. The resignation of Badula, and possibly the rumors that there are other resignations in the making, including that of the Prime Minister, signal to them that there are things that they are not getting. Now, yes, there are groups that ruled through brute force. But if you don't, and there are people who wanted absolute economic dominance, but if you don't get the politics right, you can't get the economy right, you can't get the military right. And that's what's happening at the moment. Because, for example, the economy thing, the new OPDO team is basically stepping on the throats of the military officials' investments within Oromia. Direct confrontation through investment laws, through tax laws. And they are saying legality has to be honored, the rule of law must be established, taxes must be paid, and citizens must be given fair compensation, and so on and so forth. It's very interesting. The road to redemption for OPDO and ANDM has happened to be very easy, especially in the face of the enfeebled opposition political parties. It has happened to be so easy because all they need to do to get legitimacy among their people is do administrative things, not even political things. Fix problems everywhere. People are evicted, then restore them to their place. People have a problem of housing, restore them. People have joblessness issues, give them jobs. That's what they are trying to do. And how are they trying to do it? To keep sentinels and stop contrabands and collect money and so on and so forth. Simple administrative decisions and practices are easily getting them back to the people and helping them to redeem themselves. Now, my hope, and this is very unfortunate, the international community, when they see options, they don't see these actors who are basically fragmenting from the center, from TPLF itself. What they see as an option now is the political opposition, either that is in jail or that is outside of Ethiopia. And even in this discussion that's going on, that went on in Khartoum, one of the suggestions was that let's ditch OPDO, let's just dismember OPDO. This is a kind of deal offered to TPLF, and bring in a more legitimate Oromo party, and then through that, we kind of broke it. Why do they do that? Because this is the group that made it ungovernable, made it impossible for TPLF to continue to govern, to rule in the way they used to. You see, they have made an enemy of TPLF, OPDO. So I do not think that the international community really gets the actual dynamics on the ground. And part of the reason is the activists, the political parties, all of us have sold these actors as merely TPLF by another name. Yes, they were, and they are to a certain extent. But they are here on the verge of stepping out and saying no to TPLF. If that is the case, they are the ones who can directly connect to the people, who know the system of the government, who know the institutions, who can respond, who are already responding to the demands of the people and trying to hold hands with the people. And that's the only card they have. They have no options whatsoever. And if TPLF's brute force could work, they could have easily assassinated the leaders that are now trying to prop up the Oromo protest. So I do not think they know the limits of brute force, because they have been doing it for 27 years. They know the limits of the brute force. They just don't know what they do. The only thing they have got is the international support now. Because the international community, two things. The international community is either too lazy to involve in domestic mess, because it's too bewildering, really, too baffling to understand. That's number one. Number two, they find they want an easy way out. And yes, there is an opposition there is an opposition here. We bring them together, and then we kind of negotiate some deal. And secondly, they are always infatuated with the idea of keeping stability, peace and security, and regional stability, and so on and so forth. So they don't really care about democracy, human rights, rule of law, etc. No, these are only things that come to the fore in order to actualize what they actually want. Until the regime collapses, they are not going to say, this is a more legitimate party, demand, therefore, etc. So they won't. So what has happened is that they are blinded to the developments going on within the party. They still think TPLF is the one to cut a deal with. They still think that all these others under TPLF are, within the ages of TPLF, are nothing but TPLF by other names, by Amara names, by Oromo names. I don't think that's the proper measurement. I think they need to reassess what is actually going on the ground, and they need to listen, especially with regard to the Oromo. They have little understanding of what the Oromo situation is, the dynamics on the ground. The 4 million members that are recruited into OPDO recently obviously are not the usual messengers of TPLF. They are not the usual type. They need to understand all these things, and I think the burden is on us to enlighten the international community on these matters. Now, the second question you raised is, what is the responsibility of the people? What is the responsibility of this organization in relation to these organizations? Now, the organizations, a lot of work is to be done by the organizations themselves. As I said, they need to connect with their people and embrace what the people are saying in order to be embraced by the people back. That's their responsibility. So one of the things they do is they realign themselves, their programs, their practices, their functions with the mottos, slogans, and desires of the people. Try to do easy administrative resolution to problems that have long been there, so that the people can start to trust them. And they're very easy, and they have tried it, and it has been found to be successful. And thirdly, as I said, to assert themselves in the federal institutions and redeem the federal institutions to its true constitutional root. And fourthly, I mean, the greatest problem we had in Ethiopia today, and the reason why parties are fragmented, etc., etc., and the reason it is so deplorable that Bekele Gerba and Merara Gudina are in prison is that we lack leadership. Leadership quality is what is personal leadership quality is what is lacking, and moral leaders like Bekele Gerba and Merara Gudina are in prison, and that's one of the saddest things that we see. As a consequence, these two groups now, who have a popular backing to a certain extent, should be rising up to the challenge of offering true leadership and trying to be a bridge and connect the people between North and South and win the trust of the large majority of the Ethiopian state, the Ethiopian people. Now, having said that, what do the people have to do? Now, I do not think OPDO and ANDM are the dependable political party that people have to just jump onto the bandwagon of. I do not think so. I think that people should keep the flame of protest. People should keep asserting their rights, because the more they don't, these parties do not need the people's usual kind of applause. These parties know what is not working already. They have got 4 million people as members, and it's not working for them. So there are those people who upload them every day. What they need is a very alert, assertive citizenry that is asserting itself in their territory. So people should push and push for their demands relentlessly. It is going to kind of push OPDO and ANDM to the brink. Let it do so, because they are not doing this for these parties. All right? So assert their rights, keep the flame of protest, keep the consciousness, because they should be remaining alert, because people are now very conscious. People read what is a manipulation and what is a real activity. Okay? Now, this consciousness must be kept. People should be alert. The civic engagement should continue. The engagement, the interest to watch power carefully, where it goes, what kind of spies. Now I get reports that so and so is a spy, therefore what he says shouldn't be accepted, etc., etc. So this kind of watchfulness, alertness, and there is a risk of fatigue when you run a protest for 3 years in a row. But instead of that now, because they are really coming close to the end, they need to be alert and keep pushing. Now, when they see, this is my advice to my contacts in Ethiopia, when they see OPDO and ANDM doing the right thing, they should not necessarily applaud them, because it is their responsibility to do so. They should just not be an obstacle to it. If they are doing the right thing, let them just acquiesce in it and do what they haven't done right. Push for what they haven't done right. This has to keep these organizations on their toes, so that they wouldn't take the place of TPLF and become reactionary. They should be the true democratizers. So you push them to the point where they actually have no option but to listen to the people. And by pushing them into this level and by empowering them from the bottom up, they can assert the political leadership, prop up the political leadership against the rogue military and security officials that are kind of trying to discipline every politician in every corner of the country. So that, I think, is what the people should do. They should be alert. They should be very much conscious. They should be watching power every day. And they should continue to keep the peace, because in the face of a lawless and a warmongering state, it is the people that have kept peace and ensured human security. In the face of a lazy regime that cannot even react for weeks when people are evicted, it is the people who actually ensured human security by offering donations. And the have-nots are the ones that gave more. And this is very, very interesting. And this should continue. The sense of solidarity we see everywhere should continue. Because when the state is lawless, because it is demented, it is the citizens that can keep law and order. And this responsibility keeps the TPLF's brute force from being unleashed on the people, and gives a lot of strength to the leadership within these parties in the EPRDF the fragmenting EPRDF. And that might help for these parties to redeem themselves responsibly, and for them to bring the state to its constitutional roots, which of course should be negotiated again once peace is settled, and once peace is settled, so that there is a full-blown transition to democracy and to a transformed, transfigured state-society relationship.
Thank you, Tsegaye. I wish I made this the last word, but Ezikael is older.
Oh,
So, Ezikael, they're telling us to wrap up here. I'm going to give you a minute or two to take us home. This is the last word for you.
Sure. I don't get into the mechanics of what would happen, but not to end with a very negative tone that I started earlier. I think in the last 2 years, the Oromo people in particular have shown unbelievable resilience, tolerance, and respect for human dignity in the face of a very brutal dictatorship that had absolutely no respect for human dignity. What does that mean? Now, during the protest, as they were being incited, young Oromos, as they were being instigated to burn religious centers, churches, mosques, so that religious conflict arises, as they were being attacked by the police brutally, as they were instigated to attack non-Oromos among themselves. Even recently, as bodies of killed or murdered Somalis were dumped in Oromia areas, so that Somalis would rise against them, and Oromos were being killed and evicted, losing their properties, their land, and everything that they value. They didn't raise their hands to harm anybody. When you have a rogue state, when people behave as human beings that actually see themselves in other human beings, then that gives you hope. That gives you hope that people we're not going to the fear of chaos, the fear of the war of all against all. I don't see that. So just looking at this bright spot or green shoots. The second is politically, I say that there is elite division, that the elites are divided. Here's the way I see the ANDM and OPDO. I see them as politicians or political parties that saw their handwriting on the wall, and that the people captured them. That these are organizations that were created as surrogates for TPLF. Now people actually captured them and redeemed them, and the new leaders of these, particularly the OPDO, have shown that they're responding, especially when, this is important, when the leaders of the regional government decided that they would not attend Erecha. That was the first. When a high official decided not to attend a big event, to show restraint, to remain at home and saying this is not about us, that was the very thing. It actually restrained the federal forces from taking any action. The police, the Oromia police, have shown what it means to police, what policing means so far. These are the green shoots that I see that would help us, that these were organizations that were meant to be the claw that would scratch the Oromo people. They have turned out to be protectors. These are the third leg that is remaining for this government is the international community. What I would say to the international community is, what they say is that there is no replacement. Of course, how do you expect replacement when the government has completely devastated any opposition? But you're not protecting a regime that would last there. You're going to see catastrophic end if you don't respond today. This is a popular movement. It's a movement from the groundswell. It's better to be on the side of history and the side of the people. So that's my message to the international community.
Thanks, Kel. So to wrap up, I hope the international committee heard you loud and clear, and especially TPLF heard this, because everything TPLF did turned out to be a backfire on its hands. The fact that instigated the Somali Oromo border problem brought every Oromo from every corner, from Mattu, Ili Abbabora to Najjo to Hararge. everyone who has $5, $10 pitching in to contribute tens of millions of American dollars. And when TPLF thought that killing innocent people at their religious and cultural rituals would stop Erecha, the Oromo people doubled the effort and came by 6-7 millions, more than a population of neighboring countries, and roared and showed. So I hope TPLF doesn't try for nothing all this small things that we talked about, that things we get away with. And thank you for your analysis. And this has been a special program called Deepening Crisis in Ethiopia. Thanks again to our viewers for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed our program. I thank again Professor Ezikael Gabbisa and Dr. Tsegaye Ararsa in the name of our viewers and our program engineer, Mr. Fuad. This is Derek Jahaz. Thank you and good night.